Welcome to the Research at Citi podcast. I'm your host, Anne Malone, head of North America Equity Research at Citi. I'm so pleased today to be joined by Geoff Meacham, our U.S. pharmaceuticals and biotechnology research analyst here at Citi and global head of healthcare. Geoff, I never thought I would be calling biotech old school, but with all of the chatter about artificial intelligence dominating it, I thought it would be good, though, to step back and get back into biotech for a bit. Let me kick it off with before AI, the letters that were all over the place were GLP-1. So where do we stand on the development of that large market? What's the latest there?
Thanks for having me. Excited to do this. So GLP-1s, have had a lot of commercial success for the injectables, obesity, diabetes, related indications like sleep apnea, potentially heart failure. So the universe of indications continues to expand. It's really not just about, weight loss. The clinical benefits of these drugs are far more reaching. The newer twist, I'd say, for this calendar year has been the advent of orals. So Eli Lilly has three data sets now, large scale phase threes for an oral drug. It potentially could go through a fast track pathway at the FDA and maybe approved by the end of this year. If it's a regular path, it's middle part of next year. And then Amgen has longer acting injectables that are in phase 2 and phase 3. So those are sort of the next life cycle of the original GLP-1, single week injectable drugs.
And what does longer acting get you? How often are you injecting yourself? It is once a week?
Today, it's once a week. It's very simple, clean, sub-Q injection with an auto injector, a pen, essentially. It could be once a month. It could be up to once a quarter. But the problem is that the GLP-1 pathway itself, it comes with all kinds of issues on safety, tolerability. So I think Amgen has to figure that out. But that is sort of another area where people are trying to add some value and do some exciting R&D, is to have longer extended kind of long acting assets.
And how big is the market now? How fast is it growing before we even get to the orals, which I assume turbocharges the whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say by the end of the decade, could easily be, 100 billion. You look at some of Lilly's growth, it's 30+%. Novo Nordisk, the main competitor in Europe, is in fact losing share among the injectables, and they're a little bit late to the race on the orals. But I totally agree, though, Ann. I'd say that there's going to be a place for injectables even when orals predominate. I would say steady state, maybe 60% orals, 40% injectables is how it could shake out. But don't forget, too, the diabetes indication. This is a disease where people are used to taking a drug every day for their life. And so that's going to be, I wouldn't call it slow, but it's a steady grower. And people are going to be on drug for 5 or 6 years. For obesity, you either have sort of a renter of these drugs, so 6 months or less, lose a little bit of weight, go off, or you have someone who tries the injectable drugs, loses a ton of weight, and then takes an oral, for example, as maintenance. I think that's kind of the modality that people are assuming.
And obviously life changing, but how do we afford all this? Like, where do we stand on reimbursement and who's paying for this?
Yeah, so far today, Medicare pays some, but not a big chunk of the market. Only if a patient has, like, say, cardiovascular comorbidities and does have a high BMI will they get Medicare reimbursement. Very little, if any, Medicaid. A lot of it is just today commercial pay and through employer insurance and out of pocket. Those are the three buckets that you're seeing today. Now, the one unique thing with the orals, in particular Eli Lilly, is that they have an online portal called Lilly Direct where they can potentially distribute this drug around the world, sort of a drop ship system. So that is kind of where we're going with this category, and maybe broadly in biotech and pharma, is a consumer driven business. I think President Trump is trying to push for that and to make OUS entities, pay a little bit more. But that could come with the oral. And we've done some work on this, which is really interesting, where if you had a consumer, depending on income, depending on availability of the drug. I mean, someone could pay as little as $100 out of pocket, like a subscription type of model, or up to, three or 400. The big question is global price and access and the like. But I do expect consumers to pay slightly more out of pocket than a traditional biotech or pharma drug looking forward for this category for GLP-1s.
Well, if there's anything I would assume in America that's going to be consumer led, it would be weight loss, right? That goes to the
Right.
heart of a US centric problem. So if you're in pharma or large biotech or even mid biotech and you're not GLP or GLP adjacent, is there anything else that can move the needle, or are you just left behind?
No, I mean, there are some therapeutic areas that have tons of innovation, are super exciting. I'd say technology wise, like cell and gene therapy, that was kind of the advent of a ton of IPOs in, 2020, 2021. And these are really, cool technologies. They're curative intent therapies. There's some available. One is a sickle cell drug from Vertex and CRISPR, where a patient can take a cell therapy and for 10 plus years not have to do anything. It's a single infusion. They're not ready for broader prime time. They're just not enough trials to call that technology as like, mainstream. But there's still plenty of growth in other categories. So cardiology, interesting target called LP little a, which could be, novel, transformational. Tons of stuff going on in hematology, oncology as well. And then in inflammation, a lot of kind of longer acting type of drugs, quarterly, semi-annually, which seem to be, pretty exciting and are still in the development phase for most of them.
Okay, so plenty to go.
Yeah.
Where do we stand? There seems to me anything that's in government has personnel changes, if I could phrase it that way. Where do we stand on the FDA these days in getting these technologies the appropriate review and approval cycle?
Yeah, so one of the leaders at FDA in, for example, cell and gene therapy was this executive, Peter Marks. He left the FDA a few months ago, and investors and people in the industry went just ballistic, saying, like, oh, we're now going to have delays. We're now going to have non approvals. We're going to have a lot of surprises. We're going back to the Stone Ages. Effectively, if everything has been status quo, there's nothing that I would say this year with all the changes at FDA. There are a few surprises, but none that I would say are attributable to personnel. There's a push, right, to get stuff done on time or maybe ahead of time. And the drugs that are higher risk, maybe they're slightly delayed to try to vet that. I think vaccines within, kind of the therapeutic space probably have a lot more disruption because there's been a bit of a COVID hangover with kind of the top down policy coming from CDC and recommendations. And that, I think that's probably been one of the more controversial things in healthcare. But in terms of regular way FDA or even CMS, it's been, trying to improve efficiency. And that's the name of the game.
Okay, so that's not an issue. Um, I think I deserve credit for waiting at least 10 minutes before I brought artificial intelligence back into this area, of this conversation. So it might be a record. Um, uh, what part does AI play in biotech pharma development, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about what it could do, but what about in any sort of kind of investment horizon we can think about? Where does AI play a part?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the companies have invested in technologies it's just mostly efficiency gains. I would say, on the R&D side, there are multiple disease pathways that are sort of siloed, and maybe AI can collectively put them together and create a better matrix. I don't know if that means we're going to get more biological targets or if we're going to means we're going to get more drugs. But, AI can also maybe further help vet, a molecule to predict toxicity and maybe fail it early. All about, enhancing productivity, probabilities of success. Also can be used, and maybe in the clinical trial process, like what centers around the world, can you maybe enroll patients in a study faster? Or for commercial drugs, what are areas where you could see prescriptions and scripts flow through in a more dramatic way. But what I would say is it's not, we're not yet ready for a killer app, right? A brand new application that no one's known. We're still sort of adding value along the development chain. There's been nothing that's really disruptive in AI. It just makes each step of the value chain like more efficient, maybe more productive.
Have you seen anything material in the spend and the investment that's needed? Because I think that's a big question. Is there's a lot of money going into AI, but have we seen the return on that investment yet? Is it material yet in the companies that you cover?
Not yet. They talk a lot about how they're implementing it, but they haven't, for example, quantified the level of investment. I think they're still trying to figure out how to maximize its efficiency. What I would say, though, is that could a drug be fully discovered, developed through AI and gone through the clinical trial process? That still takes like 8 to 10 years as a process. If that's the only metric, we're not really going to see a massive win from AI. I think there are other ways to say, all right, is AI, effective in the biotech and pharma industry without having to say like it's just a drug is the ultimate judgment, right?
I think we're all trying to figure out how to measure the wins, and I assume it'll keep accelerating. Um, Other hot topic, I assume, um, tariffs. So where do you believe that's going to come down on this industry?
The headlines from tariffs kind of freaked investors out, and that's actually why there are a lot of generalist investors that are not involved in big cap therapeutics. And certainly higher interest rates, lower risk appetite is why investors aren't interested in SMIDs. So the sector has taken a bit of a pause. Tariffs, what I would say is it's complicated because it has a lot to do with manufacturing sites like outside the US. It has to do with where the intellectual property is based. And it has to do with, the transfer price. So a company makes a drug typically outside the US. It goes from from a API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, to a bulk product. And then it's modified, and then it's sent to the US to sort of fill, finish, and to become the final product. All along the way, the value of that product goes up, and that value is the tax savings that you get. And so that's why I think tariffs are complicated, because you also have to convince companies to invest in manufacturing, which Trump has done to the tune of like 50 billion plus, right? You have to consider like the IP and all this stuff. So bottom line, sorry to be long-winded on this one, is that I don't think we're going to be a situation where tariffs are going to be a massive deal breaker for the industry. I would say we've done a sensitivity. 20% tariff can be mitigated through bottom line. That could come out of essentially COGS or OPEX. It's not going to be a deal breaker for the big guys, the innovator companies. It's not clear for generic companies and spec pharma companies that are lower margin. That could be, more problematic, I suspect. But we don't have any policy. All we have is a bunch of tweets and a bunch of, proclamations of the manufacturing wins, and that's kind of where we are.
So with that uncertainty on both large and SMID and those questions, does that say M&A should be more prevalent? Is that going to be a theme
Yeah.
because the large have a better, the larger you are, the better you can combat all of this, or no?
No, I think M&A, we've seen a step up in the number of deals versus like the post-COVID hangover. That's a good thing. The zip code is really sub 5 billion, doesn't matter. It's sort of a rounding error for these companies, and there's a lot of those. Anywhere up to say 20 is reasonable. And these companies generate a lot of cash. They want to deploy it. It's much better, I think, productive than doing a buyback or dividend hike. So it's more exciting. But I don't think you're going to see mega deals. But I think you'll see more and more bolt-ons, maybe heftier size bolts going forward, because you just have to consolidate winners, right? And larger mid cap biotechs that have products approved, one or more, and are still in growth mode are highly valued, right? But what's not valued are technology platforms that you have to integrate within a large pharma, and that takes more time and resources to try to do that. And I'm not sure it's worth it at this point.
And that hurts the ROI.
Right.
When are we going to get an IPO cycle in biotech? When do you think? What does that take?
I'd say the issue is that, there's a couple of things. One is that there still isn't a lot of investor appetite, but that'll change if we have some success, right? Some successful IPOs. There's been a few post deal or post listing, kind of action has not really been great. We're suffering from oversupply. At the end of the day, there are way too many companies in 2020, 2021. There's been a natural consolidation. There's been a business model of like acquiring these and shutting them down and returning the cash to shareholders. There's been some M&A. There's been some bankruptcies. And there's some just shutting down. So I think we're in a better spot. I would say 2026 to answer your question, because we'll have lower interest rates. Maybe we'll have a better macro and maybe more appetite for risk. But I don't think, because of AI and all the growth we've seen in tech, I'm not sure this will be as attractive as it once was, right?
Right. And of course, 2026 gives you more time for that digestion, right, of everything that came out in 20 and 21. Before we go, outside of tariffs, anything else like to play from the administration, whether it's taxes, et cetera? What else should we be talking about?
Yeah, MFN, most favored nation, like the OUS prices. So President Trump wants, and I agree that, for many years, for example, the UK and Germany pay dramatically lower prices for drugs versus the US customer. And all the drugs most of them have their origins in the US. Getting clarity on that. Pharmacy benefit manager is a lot more difficult of a question to tackle. But that industry, I think, is ripe for reform. Everyone talks about it, how it plays out. It's really not clear. So those are two. The issue with these policies or new strategies is really that you have to have different facets of the government, multiple facets interact and integrate to have a new policy going forward. And that's always a tough task, right? It's a tall order to get CMS, to talk to FDA, to talk to Consumer Protection Agency, for example. Good luck.
So that just sits there as an overhang.
Yeah, unfortunately,
right?
I think so.
Yeah. Right? Been there, done that. I could go on all day, but we probably ought to cut it off there. I really appreciate your time, Geoff. Terribly insightful, and we probably ought to do a part 2 if we're going to cover everything else. Thanks so much for coming.
That's good. All right. Thanks, Dan.
This episode of Research at Citi was recorded on Thursday, September 4th, 2025. I'm your host, Ann Malone. Join us next time as we discuss the internet sector with our U.S. Internet Equity Analyst, Ron Josie.
This podcast contains thematic content and is not intended to be investment research, nor does it constitute financial, economic, legal, tax, or accounting advice. This podcast is provided for information purposes only and does not constitute an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instruments. The contents of this podcast are not based on your individual circumstances and should not be relied upon as an assessment of suitability for you of a particular product, security, or transaction. The information in this podcast is based on generally available information, and although obtained from sources believed by Citi to be reliable, its accuracy and completeness are not guaranteed. Past performance is not a guarantee or indication of future results. This podcast may not be copied or distributed, in whole or in part, without the express written consent of Citi. Copyrights 2025 Citigroup Global Markets, Inc. Member SIPC. All rights reserved. Citi and Citi and Arc Design are trademarks and service marks of Citigroup Inc. or its affiliates and are used and registered throughout the world.